and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories, where we play tales to take you away from today. Yep, that was another blast off, and that can only mean that we have a science fiction tale. Add to that a very creepy ghost story sent in by Dana and Derek. We also have a
Johnny, is this true?
segment that is completely devoted to Civil War strangeness. Now, is that enough?
No.
Well, okay. How about an interview with the guy who's been reading many of the stories you've heard on the show, Mr. Mark Nelson? Sound pretty good?
Yeah!
Okay then. So here we go with this week's 5-Minute Mystery.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-Minute Mystery is being brought to you by real medical stuff, like Arskog syndrome or achondroplasia. The name is just a name until it's silly. It's kind of like calling your bike an acoustic motorbike or your bathtub a reverse boat. Now, let's get to the story before I neutralize your robotic senses.
Okay. Homicide Division, Inspector Nichols speaking. Who? Ralph Dean. The guy that backs all those nightclubs with his dough? Where? Right, I'll be there in 10 minutes. So you two are Thomas and Gerald Klein.
That's right, Inspector.
We're brothers.
Where's the body?
That's right, fellas. The coroner'd like to make his examination as soon as possible.
It's in this next room.
You see, we're both bachelors, and we have our living quarters here above the nightclub.
Right in here, Inspector.
Not much of a mess. Mustn't have been a struggle.
There wouldn't be much blood in a death like this. Death was too instantaneous.
As we said, Inspector, Dean came to Thomas and me and asked if he could come up here to talk over a business deal with this Johnson fellow. Dean had put up the money for his club, too, but Johnson wasn't cutting in with enough dough.
Was Dean financing your club, too?
Why, yes.
But to get back to the story, Inspector, Dean and Johnson came up here to this room. After about half an hour, Thomas and I heard 2 shots. We happened to be in the kitchen just below here.
We ran right up, but Johnson had beat it.
But not before he stopped to plant my necktie in Dean's hand to frame us. Make it look like I killed Dean.
How about that necktie in the victim's hand, Coroner?
It looked as though Dean ripped it off the neck of his killer.
See? Johnson's a smart operator. He knew it would look that way.
Can you remove the tie from his hand, Coroner?
Yes, if you want me to break his hand. It's a case of cadaveric spasm, Inspector. Dean has a death clutch on it, and the only way you'll remove it is by breaking the hand.
Johnson must have gone up into our wardrobe, grabbed one of Gerald's ties and torn it. Then put it into Dean's hand and forced the fingers around it.
Yeah. Johnson was jealous of our business and was double-crossing Dean, so he thought this would be a way to kill 2 birds with 1 stone.
He killed Dean and planted suspicion on us.
You might as well store your alibi, boys. Johnson had nothing to do with this. Gerald, you fired the fatal shots as your brother Thomas stood by and watched. I'm arresting both of you for Dean's murder.
Do you know what evidence proves Gerald pulled the trigger? In 1 minute, we'll be back with the solution. But first...
Oh, Inspector Nichols. First, let's get things right. It's quite impossible to grab a necktie so tightly that it can't be pulled free. Second, while cadaveric spasm is a real thing, it's so very rare that it's discounted in most investigation. But there is one point that makes your case plausible. The victim has to be alive and holding the item before his death. Now let's get back.
Now, back to the inspector and his explanation.
Johnson couldn't have planted that necktie, Gerald. That tie of yours in Dean's hand is the clue proving your guilt. As you walked close to him and shot, he grabbed at you, caught hold of your tie, and in falling, tore the tie off. When a person dies suddenly, as did Dean, They often clutch tenaciously as to whatever happens to be in their hands. Their fingers are set in an unmovable grasp. In that case, it's a medical impossibility for anyone to place something in the victim's hand and cause that dead hand to grasp it as tightly as Dean has your tie. That clue in Dean's hand is going to be worth 2 killers in the electric chair.
Well, isn't that a great use of a very old cliché? Did you know the phrase, "a bird in hand is worth more than 2 in the bush," refers to medieval falconry? In this case, the bird in the hand, the falcon, was certainly worth more than 2 in the bush. How that relates to catching 2 killers, I'm going to leave to you. This was all brought to you by saying nonsense and making it sound believable.
What's that you say?
Well, if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you know that we play stories. But what you may not know is that a lot of those stories come from a place called LibriVox.org. LibriVox is a fantastic home to just about everything audio that you can imagine. One of the things that I discovered was a gentleman by the name of Mark Nelson. You've heard his stories now, several of them, and from the feedback, you guys loved him. Now, wouldn't it be interesting to talk to Mark just for a few minutes? Well, you know what? By the magic of radio, I'd like to present to you Mr. Mark Nelson.
Greetings.
Now, were you surprised when I contacted you to be on a podcast, or do you get requests to talk on shows all the time?
I've actually got a couple in the past, so I was surprised by this one, but it's not something that was completely out of my experience.
So let's talk a little bit about what you do. You are an audiobook reader. Do they have a title for that?
I think we go by narrator, audiobook narrator.
How did you get involved in that? What's your story?
Well, what happened was 40 years ago, I got my undergraduate degrees in radio and TV and theater. And back in those days, if you didn't get a job in literally a radio station, TV station, or in an actual theater, you probably weren't going to get a job in those fields because there wasn't the internet. Cable TV was in its infancy. So when I didn't get anything soon after graduation, I did what a lot of people with useless degrees do. I joined the English majors and the Oriental art history majors, and I ended up in human resources.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I ended up doing that. I gave it a try. I thought, well, this isn't bad. It pays the bills. I'll give it 28, 29 years, and if I don't like it, I'll think of something else. In 2005, I was working for a tech company here in Silicon Valley, and we got the word that we're being bought out and that the acquiring company was going to shut us down. There was going to be no go forward at all. My job was going to end. But it wasn't going to end for a year and a half. It was a hardware company. It takes a while to shut down. So I had time to think about what I was going to do next. Now, the life plan was to retire at 55. So I found myself at not quite 54, not going to have a full-time job, but with a fairly decent severance package. So I decided during this year and a half where I had time to think that I would do something closer to what I originally trained to do. And so I was open to thinking of different things I might use my radio and TV training to do. It just so happens it was August of 2006, my wife and I took a short vacation up to Seattle, and she wanted to buy a newspaper. And didn't want to buy a local newspaper because we don't care what the city council of Seattle's doing. She bought a New York Times. It just happened to be, and I am not making this up, the New York Times issue with a full-page story on the 1-year anniversary of LibriVox.
Really?
Yes. And I read the story and went, I hadn't thought about audiobook narrating. Well, that's something I should look into. I mean, I read constantly. It's what similar to what I'm trained to do. In fact, I already had a microphone because I dabbled in doing little animations that I voiced myself. So when I got back home, I went to the website, checked out some samples, and I was very impressed by the quality of work they did. Light entertainment has been suffering ever since.
Well, I guess that's where I enter the story and listen to some of your work on LibriVox. And what's interesting is I'm guessing you and I have a passion for old science fiction.
You know what it is? That was my youth. I grew up reading H. Beam Piper and Isaac Asimov, and it's a chance to go back and reconnect with that time in my life when I was, in high school, early college. So, yeah, I have a deep affection for the classic sci-fi, and also because it was, in many cases, more creative than what we see in a lot of new science fiction. A lot of the stuff you see in new science fiction is a rehash of what those writers were doing 30, 40 years ago.
You know what I find shocking about old-time science fiction is I have recently, because of you actually, been going through the Astounding Stories magazines, not realizing that a lot of that is public domain now. And what I have found is, I'm going to use the word, an astounding amount of really good, scientifically accurate science fiction. It was astounding.
I think that era, many of the writers emphasized what we would call hard science fiction, in that they tried to inject some actual science, at least the science of the time. It was less, I think, fantasy-based in an attempt to be more, forward-looking, predicting the future. But you need to base that out of actual science.
And they did. They actually predicted the future much better than I thought they did, because my experience with it up until then are, the 50s movies, the cheap B-rate movies that were so outlandish that there was nothing really good there. And I thought, that must have been everything up until that point. Everything must have been kind of quirky that way, but it's just not true. They had a very good grasp on what science could do, and especially when it came to the atomic bomb era.
Yeah.
Fascinating, the things that they understood in the 30s that we didn't go, oh my gosh, atomic bombs are bad.
Yes, and you have to think also in the 1950s, okay, this was real to them. The bombs had just been dropped. Most of us today, we don't really think about atomic bombs that much, other than sort of in a theoretical way. But then they were being exploded. Islands were being blown up with them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is science and news the people were paying attention to at the time.
Yes, it is. And what I'm finding is that those stories play as well today as they did in the 1930s, maybe even better.
Often, yes. There are a few things that get dated. Their concept of computers wasn't quite what we have today. But otherwise, yeah, they hold up. They really do.
I'm looking at the numbers here, and I'm looking at least 136 stories that you have read for LibriVox. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right. I think there were about close to 100 full-length novels, and then I don't do that many short stories, but probably the rest were short stories.
Let's talk a little bit about LibriVox. Why LibriVox? Why did you do it? It's obviously free.
It's obviously free, and I was in a situation where I didn't have to be greedy, and I could do it just for the fun of it. And there is something to be said for hobbies. To do something just for the pure fun of it, and not necessarily because you can make money at it. And I do some commercial narration, and I do some commercial voiceover, and that's fine, but that's not necessarily the funnest part of the time I spend behind a microphone.
Is it reading 1930s fiction, science fiction?
It is part of it, yes. That's part of it. Part of it is being able to pick my own projects, take as many chances with it, not having anyone to answer to, not having a producer or an author second-guessing my choices. So it's very freeing.
Well, I'm going to tell you, some of the comments that we get is that probably the most notable, when I play an old-time radio science fiction, I get a lot of, oh, that was really neat. I really enjoyed that. When I play one of your stories, I get, man, he made me feel the story. He made me feel like I was right there with him hearing this. And it's astounding how he could just sit there and tell me these stories from this old time, and I love it, and thank you for playing it. And those are the kind of comments I get when I play one of your stories. And that's not an exaggeration. My own brother said he would much rather hear a story read by you than something that came from X-1.
Wow. Well, that's very kind.
And it's true. You have a real talent for making the story your story. Even though you may not have written it, you can feel how important it was for you to get it right.
Well, that's gratifying to hear, because as a narrator, what you should be trying to do, at least I feel like what a narrator should do and what I attempt to do, is make the listener experience the story as if they had read it themselves. And that requires a certain amount of commitment to the story. It doesn't matter, what the content is. You got to be committed to it and really try to sell, really commit to every line in the text to hopefully make it as enjoyable as if you read it yourself.
And I'm going to say that's exactly what you do. It is a joy to listen to. I enjoy listening to my podcasts several times, re-listening to the stories that you tell.
Wow.
Because I pick up something different every time. A different inflection, a different something that makes me go, that makes that story all brand new again. And that's a skill, and it is a talent. And so, my friend, you are a talented narrator.
Well, thank you.
Do you have a favorite? Do you have something that makes you go, this is the story that I want to read?
Well, there's a couple that I think are favorites of mine. One is Space Prison by Tom Godwin.
Tom Godwin. Go ahead. I'm sorry. You shocked me.
Yes. And Godwin, I think, mainly wrote short stories for the magazines, but he did do some full-length novels. And Space Prison is a book that seems like it's got everything in it. It's got space travel. It's got aliens. It's got space warfare. It's got people abandoned on a terrible planet and what happens to them. And the characters were really well developed. And also, it was a story arc where, as you read it, you go, well, where's this going? Where's this going? Where's this going? And then suddenly there's aha. Now I see it. And I really enjoyed that one. One other that was a personal favorite of mine, just because I spent so much time on it, was Creatures of the Abyss, and that's by Murray Leinster. And that was the one book I did for actually Project Gutenberg and then LibriVox from soup to nuts. I did the whole thing.
Familiar.
Yeah, what happened was, in around 2010, somebody emailed me and said, you really ought to look at this, do this book, Creatures of the Abyss. It's a great book. It's a Murray Leinster, and people have forgotten it. Well, I checked into it. It wasn't available on Project Gutenberg, which is the go-to place for LibriVox texts, because they're all certified as being public domain. There's no question about the copyright status. And LibriVox, you can't do anything that would put them in legal jeopardy, basically. So they have to know that it's cleanly PD. At that time, though, I don't know why. I don't know if it was lack of resources or they lacked volunteers or what was going on, but PG was not doing clearances on expired copyrights. They were only adding new titles that were pre-1923, which were always public domain in the U.S. So I wrote the guy back and said, I'm sorry. I did a quick copyright check online, and it appears to be public domain, but PG isn't clearing these, so LibriVox won't let me do it. So sorry, but we'll try again later. Well, about 3 years later, PG started doing clearances on expired copyrights again. So I contacted my I guess you would call him an expert on both classic sci-fi and copyright. His name is Greg Weeks, and asked him about the book. And he did a check and said, I think you're good. Here's what you have to do to get it on Project Gutenberg so you can record it for LibriVox. So I had to find an actual physical copy of the original 1961 book, which turned out to be really easy. I just went to Amazon, put up the title, and found used bookstores that were selling the book and found an original 1961 paperback of the book. Got it in my hands. I did all the scanning myself, sent the scans off to Project Gutenberg, and in a matter of weeks, it was cleared, and I was able to record it. And it really was. The guy was right. It was a fantastic story.
Wow. I just went through my records here, and I found that we had a story on episode 329 by Tom Godwin, read by you, called The Nothing Equation. Do you remember that one?
I do remember that one. So that was hard science and just was so creepy.
It's a crazy good story. And that's another one that I have gotten just absolute nothing but positive feedback on. And it's another story that could play today easily. observation bubble light years away from Earth. You're stuck in this terrible situation by yourself. And well, of course you're going to go crazy.
Yes, indeed.
I don't know that I could play an entire novel. I have toyed with the idea of doing a secondary podcast, doing a serial where I do a collection of chapters over several weeks. Mm-hmm. And I would love to take some of those books that you just talked about and put them on, on that type of scheduling. It would be, I think that there would be some interest in that, I think. And one of the things that I like to do as a podcaster is bring back things that people don't necessarily know even exist. And I think that that's what you do by reading these classic science fiction stories and some of the other ones. You've done it horror. You've done, I'm just kind of looking at the list. I've done classics, a couple. I'm just The Count of Monte Cristo.
Just a couple of chapters.
Yeah, Crime and Punishment.
I did Crime and Punishment, yes.
Here's Creatures of the Abyss that you were talking about.
Yeah.
And I mean, just so many. And I would encourage the listeners, what you should do is go to LibriVox.org and search by Mark Nelson. And you will be amazed at what you can hear that he has read. And with that, Mark, I'm going to say, is there anything else you want to tell us about LibriVox or yourself?
Well, fortunately, LibriVox is still going strong. Classic sci-fi good books are getting scarcer and scarcer since we've kind of all been through them at this point. But I'm hoping to keep looking for some more. And I expect to be contributing to LibriVox for a long, long, long time.
Well, Mark, I want to thank you for being on the show. I want to thank you more than ever for what you do. It is an important service, and I wish you the best success in your narration endeavors, because you are truly one of the best.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
That was great fun, and I want to thank Mark Nelson for coming on the podcast today. He truly is good at what he does. If you want to know more about Mark or find his works, I'll have all the links for you in the show notes. One thing that we didn't talk about was that Mark is available for voiceover and narration work. You can find out more about that on his website at markdouglasnelson.com. Thank you, Mark. I thought to myself, we can't just have Mark Nelson on the show and not feature something he has read. So I give to you the introduction from the book, Anything You Can Do, by Randall Garrett. Now I know what you're thinking. Just chapter 1? How can you do that? Well, as it turns out, the first chapter is kinda standalone. However, it should generate interest in the book, and I'll have a link directly to the rest of it in the show notes so that you can continue on where we left off. I have a lot to say about this book, but I'm going to hold off until you've heard the story's beginning. Here is Mark Nelson reading Chapter 1 of Anything You Can Do.
Chapter 1 of Anything You Can Do by Randall Garrett. Like some great silver-pink fish, the ship sang on through the eternal night. There was no impression of swimming. The fish shape had neither fins nor a tail. It was as though it were hovering in wait for a member of some smaller species to swoop suddenly down from nowhere, so that it, in turn, could pounce and kill. But still it moved and sang. Only a being who was thoroughly familiar with the type could have told that this particular fish was dying. In shape, the ship was rather like a narrow flounder, long, tapered, and oval in cross-section. But it showed none of the exterior markings one might expect of either a living thing or a spaceship. With one exception, the smooth silver-pink exterior was featureless. That one exception was a long, purplish-black, roughened discoloration that ran along one side for almost half of the ship's 17 meters of length. It was the only external sign that the ship was dying. Inside the ship, the Nipe neither knew nor cared about the discoloration. Had he thought about it, he would have deduced the presence of the burn, but it was by far the least of his worries. The ship sang, and the song was a song of death. The internal damage that had been done to the ship was far more serious than the burn on the surface of the hull. It was the internal damage which occupied the thoughts of the Nipe, for it could, quite possibly, kill him. He had, of course, no intention of dying. Not out here. Not so far, so very far from his own people. Not out here, where his death would be so very improper. He looked at the ball of the yellow-white sun ahead, and wondered that such a relatively stable, inactive star could have produced such a tremendously energetic plasmoid, one that could still do such damage so far out. It had been a freak, of course. Such suns as this did not normally produce such energetic swirls of magneto-hydrodynamic force. But the thing had been there nonetheless, and the ship had hit it at high velocity. Fortunately, the ship had only touched the edge of the swirling cloud, otherwise the ship would have vanished in a puff of incandescence. But it had done enough. The power plants that drove the ship at ultra-light velocities through the depths of interstellar space had been so badly damaged that they could only be used in short bursts, and each burst brought them closer to the fusion point. Even when they were not being used, they sang away their energies in ululations of wavering vibration that would have been nerve-wracking to a human being. The Nipe had heard the singing of the engines, recognized it for what it was, realized that he could do nothing about it, and dismissed it from his mind. Most of the instruments were powerless. The Nipe was not even sure he could land the vessel. Any attempt to use the communicator to call home would have blown his ship to atoms. The Nipe did not want to die, but if die he must, he did not want to die foolishly. It had taken a long time to drift in from the outer reaches of this sun's planetary system, but using the power plants any more than was absolutely necessary would have been foolhardy. The Nipe missed the companionship his brother had given him for so long. His help would be invaluable now, but there had been no choice. There had not been enough supplies for two to survive the long inward fall toward the distant sun. The Nipe, having discovered the fact first, had, out of his mercy and compassion, killed his brother while the other was not looking. Then, having disposed of his brother with all due ceremony, he had settled down to the long, lonely wait. Beings of another race might have cursed the accident that had disabled the ship, or regretted the necessity that one of them should die. But the Nipe did neither, for to him the first notion would have been foolish, and the second incomprehensible. But now, as the ship fell ever closer toward the yellow-white sun, he began to worry about his own fate. For a while it had seemed almost certain that he would survive long enough to build a communicator, for the instruments had already told him and his brother that the system ahead was inhabited by creatures of reasoning power, if not true intelligence, and it would almost certainly be possible to get the equipment he needed from them. Now, though, it looked as if the ship would not survive a landing. He had had to steer it away from a great gas giant, which had seriously endangered the power plants. He did not want to die in space, wasted, forever undevoured. At least he must die on a planet, where there might be creatures with the compassion and wisdom to give his body the proper death rites. The thought of succumbing to inferior creatures was repugnant, but it was better than rotting to feed monocells or ectogenes, and far superior to wasting away in space. Even thoughts such as these did not occupy his mind often or for very long. Far, far better than any of those thoughts were thoughts connected with the desire and planning for survival. The outer orbits of the gas giants had been passed at last, and the Nipe fell on through the asteroid belt without approaching any of the larger pieces of rock and metal. That he and his brother had originally elected to come into this system along its orbital plane had been a mixed blessing. To have come in at a different angle would have avoided all the debris, from planetary size on down, that is thickest in a star's equatorial plane. But it would also have meant a greater chance of missing a suitable planet unless too much reliance were placed on the already weakened power generators. As it was, the Nipe had been fortunate in being able to use the gravitational field of the gas giant to swing his ship toward the precise spot where the third planet would be when the ship arrived in the third orbit. Moreover, the planet would be retreating from the Nipe's line of flight, which would make the velocity difference that much the less. For a while, the Nipe had toyed with the idea of using the mining bases that the local life form had set up in the asteroid belt as bases for his own operations, but he had decided against it. Movement would be much freer and more productive on a planet than it would be in the belt. He would have preferred using the fourth planet for his base. Although much smaller, it had the same reddish, arid look as his own home planet, while the third planet was 3/4 drowned in water. But there were two factors that weighed so heavily against that choice that they rendered it impossible. In the first place, by far the greater proportion of the local inhabitants' commerce was between the asteroids and the third planet. Second, and even more important, the fourth world was at such a point in its orbit that the energy required to land would destroy the ship beyond any doubt. It would have to be the third planet. As the ship fell inward, the Nipe watched his pitifully inadequate instruments, doing his best to keep tabs on every one of the ships that the local life form used to move through space. He did not want to be spotted now, and even though the odds were against these beings having any instrument highly developed enough to spot his own craft, there was always the possibility that he might be observed optically. So he squatted there in his ship, a centipede-like thing about 5 feet in length and a little less than 18 inches in diameter, with 8 articulated limbs spaced in pairs along his body, each limb ending in a 5-fingered manipulatory organ that could be used equally well as a hand or foot. His head, which was long and snouted, displayed 2 pairs of violet eyes that kept a constant watch on the indicators and screens of the few instruments that were still functioning aboard the ship. And he waited as the ship fell toward its rendezvous with the third planet. End of Chapter 1.
Did that interest you just a bit? It did me, and I was hooked. The entire book is 23 chapters long and takes about 6 hours to listen to. I'm here to tell you that I'm about halfway through, and this is a remarkable story. Here is Mark Nelson's very own summary. An alien crash lands on Earth and for 10 years terrorizes the planet, hiding, periodically killing, eating people, and stealing materials for some unknown purpose. The only hope is Bart Stanton, a medically engineered Superman, designed for the sole purpose of confronting the Nipe. The book really is a collection of stories told from various points of view. Its author, Randall Garrett, was an American science fiction and fantasy author. He loved the science fiction magazines of the 1950s and 60s and showed his support with at least 100 short stories, some of which you've heard right here on the podcast. Now, if you want to continue the story, head to LibriVox.org and search for the title, Anything You Can Do. I will also have a direct link in the show notes. It's totally free and public domain, but make sure you pick version 1 of the book so that you can hear it read by Mark Nelson. And now, these are your stories.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
story this week, and it comes from Dana and Derek in Fort Worth, Texas. Dana writes, "My husband and I love a good ghost story, and we were determined to experience one for ourselves. We are known for going out of our way to stay in places that are supposed to be haunted. We had absolutely no luck until we weren't trying. Derek and I were in Dallas for a family reunion, and we had decided to stay in one of the better hotels in town, the Adolphus. It is one of the swankiest hotels in Texas, and unknown to us at that time, it's also home to one of the most active hauntings. We booked something special, a luxury suite with its own terrace. It had the most incredible views of Dallas, with plenty of room to move around and to have guests. Our plan was to share it with the family and just have a good time. We did all of that, and we got our one and only ghost story. It was Saturday night, and we were due to check out the next morning. We had been trying to book reservations in the French War Room and had had no luck. Finally, we got the call that an 11 p.m. dinner time had opened, and it was ours if we wanted it. We surely did, and thought, what a great end to our Dallas trip. We decided to go all out and every bit dressed the part for dinner. We were walking in the hallway to the elevators when it happened. A woman wearing a white wedding dress ran right past us. This in itself was strange because of the hour. The woman seemed distressed, and I remarked to Derek, "Wow, I'll bet she has a story to tell." Derek looked at me blankly and said, "Who has a story to tell?" "Well, that woman that just ran by in the wedding dress," I replied. He just continued to look at me and told me that he hadn't seen any woman. I was sure of what I saw, and I described him to her. His face went white. Then he told me that a steward had told him earlier that day about a bride who was set to wed in one of the hotel's ballrooms back in the 1930s. No one knows all the details except that she had killed herself instead. She is said to roam the halls of the 19th floor where she hung herself, still wearing her wedding gown. Even when she can't be seen, the sound of her sobbing can be heard and is often accompanied by the chiming of a music box. I could not believe what he had told me, but I do believe my eyes. I saw what I saw, and I stand by it. By the way, our room was on the 19th floor. Later that night, after a wonderful dinner, we returned to our room. As we entered, there was a chill that we could not explain. The thermal control said the room was a perfect 78 degrees. We both could see our breath, and that lasted for about 5 minutes. For the rest of the night, everything was calm. When I got home, the first thing I did was to Google the Adolphus Ghost Bride, and it turns out that she isn't alone. The spirit of another woman lingers in the hotel's bistro, and often patrons complain of the sound of footsteps echoing in the halls, even though they're all carpeted. Windows fly open and slam on their own. A phantom piano can be heard playing at night, and many of the guests have reported being touched by unseen hands. Well, there you have it, my story. I want to thank you for your podcast and hope that you read this to your listeners. I think they're going to like it. Dana from Fort Worth, Texas. Well, Dana, that was an amazing story. My favorite story submissions are those that contain verifiable facts. Yours seems to have a pretty rich history. I did a little research as well and found that the hotel was named after Adolphus Busch, founder of the Anheuser-Busch Company. The Hotel Adolphus opened its doors in 1912. This Baroque-style luxury hotel has sheltered more than a few notable guests, including Warren G. Harding, George H.W. Bush, Elizabeth II, and Prince Philip. What does the hotel say about your ghosts? they confirm in their own brochure that not all of the hotel guests have checked out. Very cool, and thank you, Dana, for your story. If you want to put your story on Ron's Amazing Stories, it's easy to do. Just head to the main website at ronsamazingstories.com, click on the story submission page, and just follow the instructions. Next thing you know, you'll be hearing your story on the show.
Johnny, is this true?
Okay, I like to surf the internet looking for stories and other oddities. I do this in the name of the podcast, but the truth is, it's fun to see what's out there. What you're about to hear is what I call...
Johnny, is this true?
I will tell you a story and then ask the question, did I make it up or is it true? This time on Johnny, Is It True? We have a special Civil War edition of our game. So, let's get started. Story 1. In 1858, the U.S. Capitol gave the world an early preview of the war to come. Congress was debating the statehood of Kansas. Their proposed constitution permitted slavery and prohibited free blacks from living in the state. The Northern Republicans were furious. They spent days arguing about it. As the debate went on, extending past midnight, they started drinking heavily just to keep from falling asleep. It was 1:30 a.m. when Lawrence Kite, a Democrat who was drunk out of his mind, stood up, pointed in Republican Joshua Grove's face, and slurred out, "You're a Republican puppy." To which Grove snapped back, "No Kansas mule shall crack this whip over me." Lunging at Grove, Kite yelled that he was going to choke the life out of him, and the whole building erupted into a vicious brawl. There was an effort to calm it down. The Speaker of the House, James Lawrence Orr, tried banging the House mace, but that only made things worse. Another congressman, misunderstanding what the Speaker was trying to do, thought that this meant that weapons were fair game. The congressman grabbed a metal spittoon and smashed it into a nearby congressional head. The fight didn't stop until Orr grabbed William Barksdale in a headlock and started punching him in the skull. Barksdale broke free, but his hairpiece didn't come with him. Embarrassed, he picked it up off the ground and put the wig on backwards. The politicians burst into laughter, and everyone finally calmed down. Now, was the fighting pacified by a man's wig, or is this just Civil War fakery? If you said true, you got it right. This really happened. The most infamous floor brawl in the history of the U.S. House of Representatives erupted as members debated the Kansas Territory's pro-slavery constitution. It occurred on February 6th, shortly before 2 a.m. How about that? Story 2. The Civil War was a rough time in our nation's history. To this day, it still causes hurt and unrest. But did you know that at one point, both sides were forced to stop fighting, work together, and deal with a national threat? Late one July morning in 1864, a 12-year-old farm girl watched the sunlight dim and a peculiar darkness sweep over a Kansas sky. A whirling, rasping sound followed, and there appeared, as she later recalled, a moving gray screen between the sun and the earth. Then something dropped from the cloud like hail, hitting her family's house, trees, and picket fence. A child in Jefferson County, Kansas, who had gone out at midday to draw water from the well, exclaimed, They're here! The sky is full of them! The whole yard is crawling with the nasty things!" A settler in Edwards County, Texas, reported, "I never saw such a sight before. This morning we looked up towards the sun and we could see millions in the air. They looked like snowflakes." What the Kansas trio saw that summer was also observed by others statewide and across the Dakota Territory, Montana Territory, Wyoming Territory, Colorado Territory, Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, Indian Territory, which is present-day Oklahoma, and of course, Texas. General Milton James of the Union Army and Robert E. Lee himself halted all attacks so that this menace to crops and homesteads across the country could be dealt with. Now, did this all happen, or did I make it up? If you thought that this happened, you are partially correct. In 1874, well after the Civil War, a locust plague occurred across the plains that not only caused catastrophic crop damage, but also blocked out the sun. The Rocky Mountain locust was a long-time pest in the Midwest until the end of the 19th century. It grew to be a major concern beginning in July of 1874, when the largest recorded swarm of over 124 billion insects attacked the U.S. Truly an alien invasion of epic proportions. Story 3. Before the Civil War, King Rama IV of Siam found out that the U.S. didn't have elephants. This, King Rama felt, was a tragedy and one that needed to be righted as soon as possible. When the Civil War began, Rama jumped on the opportunity. He wrote to Abraham Lincoln, offering to send him as many war elephants as he required. Okay, you've heard the story, but is it true? If you said this one was real, then you got it right. King Rama IV explained that the elephants would not only help him crush the Confederates, but could also be put to work on construction projects. Lincoln did his best to be polite. He replied, "I appreciate most highly your Majesty's tender of good offices. However, our political jurisdiction does not reach a latitude so low as to favor the multiplication of the elephant." I personally think he missed out. I have seen elephants used in battle and at work, and in both cases, elephants are truly amazing. Story 4. Most people who are familiar with the Civil War know that Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, the famous Confederate Lieutenant General, died from a fatal gunshot wound. However, it was not from a Union soldier. It was his own men that actually shot him in the Battle of Chancellorsville on May 2nd, 1863. How could this be true? He was the beloved general and certainly could not have been killed by friendly fire. Or could he? Do you believe that he was killed by his own men? If you said true, then you know your Civil War history. But what really happened on that fateful night? Most historians state that Jackson was shot because of darkness and confusion on the battlefield. But the waters of history have been fairly muddy on this particular subject. Jackson's fame, whether infamous or loved, was claimed by all. Many said that they were involved in his death, and conspiracy theories of murder and foul play abound. The question was finally answered in 2013, near the 150th anniversary of the great general's death. Two astronomers painstakingly calculated the phases of the moon during that night. When Jackson was returning to his troops, the moon was so dim that it would have only revealed his silhouette. When the fatigued, frightened soldiers were startled by this mysterious soldier-shaped shadow, they instinctively opened fire. Do Do you have any strange but true stories you want to share? If you do, send them to ronsamazingstories@gmail.com, and I'll use them if I can. What a great show. Yes, that's my own thoughts. I want to thank those that contributed to this podcast. To Mark Nelson, I say thank you for your time, and it was a lot of fun. To Dana and Derek, wow, what a chilling ghost story. See you all next time, and don't forget to send me your stories. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, it's easy to do. Just head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you're going to find all the links you'll need. We are on Twitter, Facebook, iTunes, TuneIn, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many other services. Pick one and do leave some feedback about the show. It really does help us to grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.
All of the vintage audio used in the podcast is believed to be in the public domain. Ron's Amazing Stories does not own the rights to any of the old-time radio used here. If you hold the rights to any of the shows played, please contact us immediately at ronsamazingstories.com.